Thank you, Brent, and thank you to the rest of the organizers for this event. I'm really excited to be here and to talk to you about design systems and design operations in general. So I'm Catriona, as Brent mentioned, and I just joined InVision about a month ago as the Director of Design for our Design System Manager product. And before that, I was at Salesforce for about 4 years. And there I was in part working with our Lightning Design System team. You may have heard of that if you're familiar with design systems on the more operational side of how product designers and developers work with our design system. So that's kind of the main gist of what we're here to talk about today. So for this panel, what we're going to focus on is a quick overview about what design systems are. If you're not terribly familiar with them, we'll kind of start there, and then mostly focus on what does that mean for you in particular from a product management standpoint. How does it impact your product development process and any other kind of operational factors that you might be facing. So I just want to start by having the panel introduce themselves. So if you can kind of go down the row and talk about who you are and your role in your company, that'd be a great start.
Hi, I'm Leland Rechis. I'm the product lead for the material design system at Google.
Hi, I'm Evan English. I lead product development and design at Amex, focused on our membership experiences.
Hi, I'm Abigail Hart Gray. I lead our display and video ad software for Google.
Hi, I'm Laura Hahn. I head up the design team at Priceline, both brand and product.
Great. So welcome, everybody. Glad to talk to you today. So let's just kind of start with some level setting and some basic stuff, because some of you might not be as familiar with design systems as some others might be. So Leland, maybe if you can kick us off and just, as we say design systems, what exactly are we talking about?
Yeah, sure. And it's the instructor of me of being at Cornell, so I want to say, what do you think design system means to you? I realize that I'm being asked. And especially from the product point of view, like a little bit of from my point of view of design systems, and please jump in, is in the dark ages we had we were just like throwing stuff at the wall and trying to apply to brand, and you get in arguments over a PM, over like, is that the right blue, and all that happened. And then designers were like, maybe we should have style guides, and maybe we should have sticker sheets. I'm actually not sure which came first, but we started to create these tools that allowed us to create cohesive products. I would say the design system emerged out of these, what I would call bare bone tools, because the design system allows you to really apply a narrative and a framework and evolution to design, right? So you're not, if you think about it, in the old days, if there was a sticker sheet and a style guide, you would have all these discussions with brand and marketing and design reviews and like update the style guide, and then, oh, now you got to update the sticker sheet, and no one really realized you should do the two at the same time. It would be some designer in left field be like, oh, I got a sticker sheet in OmniGraffle. That was a throwback on purpose. And it's like, wait, there's a better way to do this. And the poor engineer was just kind of like, I just have to now rewrite everything. So there's this rationalization of how does this all come together? How does brand, how does engineering, how does product, how does design come together? And the design system really allows for that to happen. It's a rationalized way of design guidelines. And the way we think about it on material is we have our design guidelines. We have which talk about not just the what, but also the why. We have assets, creative assets. So for Google, it's Google Fonts, it's our icon library. We then have componentry, which is really where I feel like design is really hitting engineering, where you can have these effective libraries that can easily stand up the baseline of an app, right? So now designers and developers can focus on the more difficult parts of the app, like writer-to-writer interaction in Peloton, rather than like buttons and just baseline widgets and navigation, right? And then from there, we think about the workflow and the tool chain, right? So now we have all these assets coming together, all these components, all this code. What is the right way to create a great workflow between developer, designer, product, brand? How do we do that? And that to me is like where it's also the evolution of design system, where it just may have been guidelines, and it's really getting deeper into product development and workflow.
Great. That's a great summary. I don't know if you missed anything. That was pretty good.
I think you covered it.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I think that was a great summary. For us at Amex, it's been a great tool to drive culture change as well. So
Yes.
What I mean by that, there's sort of two examples. One, from a product strategy and product management standpoint, within the first day of a job as a new hire on our product team, you know what the DLS is, you're using it, you're being educated on that's what design means. And then it's also helping educate our broader organization and driving advocacy for design. So just letting an organization as big as Amex know that we have design thought leadership, and here is this central tool where design lives and breathes, and our engineers use it, and it's part of a much broader product management stack. It's really driven a lot of education, and it's become a cultural tool for us as well as a execution tool or product
Just
management.
to pile on that, I think it also has helped us. Yeah, I know, I said it would. But I've walked into organizations before where maybe engineering and design wasn't working closely enough, and in instituting a design system, suddenly we're not necessarily forcing this collaboration, but it sort of comes ground up from working together to create the design system in a way where I think for a lot of our designers at least, they learned how much engineering cares about making a great product and has good ideas. And so I think that there was like education on both sides, which made them kind of bond together and collaborate when we were doing more product-focused work even more.
Yeah. I think in its ideal state, it's kind of less of a design system and more of a design language where there's a vocabulary and there's a syntax. I think right now a lot of the design systems that I'm seeing are kind of missing that syntax portion to a certain extent, but a language both for your product, but then also I think for that internal communication, like how do you collaborate around that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think one thing that surprised me in coming onto the material design team of how much like Google and material design cares about language and cares about just the nice language, not just visual language, but writing, and that's actually part. And we think about, it's not just the pixels you see. It's anything from motion to language, everything throughout that helps align across a company.
Yeah, it's great. And many organizations are at different stages in what we call in the design system biz, which is a thing, the design system maturity spectrum. So from people who don't even have a system yet, who are trying to figure out if it's something that we should do, all the way through super, super advanced design systems. So could each of you talk a little bit about where you are kind of on that spectrum and how your teams have kind of aligned around this, if they have it all?
So Priceline has an open source design system right now. It was very much engineering led, so it's largely React components and a lot of API documentation. Right now, what we're trying to do is overlay more usage guidelines around that. Why would you be using certain components and when? What's the how-to for how you actually assemble these things? I think that's where we're sort of driving next. Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things for us, so I think, Leland, correct me if I'm wrong, that you focus more on the consumer-facing products, whereas I focus on B2B products. One of the learnings for us has been that you actually need two different design systems, which are very closely related, but one for enterprise solutions where there's a different kind of mindset of the user, and one for consumer-facing, which is the material that I hope people know and love. I think they love it. I love it. And so I think that's been really interesting. Like, how do you address the needs of a table for a consumer-facing product versus how do you address the needs of a table, this is just an example, for a really heavy kind of like super powerful B2B software. So I think that's one of the things that we're in process of developing, of how do you operationalize developing those at scale and also a little bit with speed, because it does take some time and additional thinking to think about these two different use cases. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we're effectively like the central design system. What we've realized was that consumer was not easy, very difficult, but consumer was in our headlights, and we're like, wow, not only is there enterprise, there are a lot of enterprise teams.
Right.
At Google, or even on the third party where we open source material, we have like Walmart has like built everything. Like when you're in a warehouse at Walmart and you were like scanning packages, that is built on material design. So like the interesting thing about design systems is that they can scale up on top of each other and effectively keep extending each other, which I find very interesting, as it's more of a way of thinking.
Yeah, at Amex, we're almost 3 years old, our design system language. Third year birthday in January, I think. It started within one product team that was very much focused on a core part of our experience centered around account management for our card members. And there was a conscious decision about a year ago to move the design language system team into our enterprise shared services and frameworks team so that the design language could sit with a broader family of products and tools that all need to work cohesively together at an enterprise level. So content management tools, other product framework tools, and the idea was that we could take more of an enterprise lens and then have families and different versions of the system language all sitting together. And so that's getting off the ground, and the tools are becoming more integrated. We still have a ways to go as we drive that scale, but we're seeing now acquisition teams start to adopt it. Our native app teams are driving their own language, but the end goal is for it all to sit together as part of one broader family.
Yeah, that's great. And a lot of you talked about having a design system team. Do you need to have a design system team in place to have a design system?
It helps.
I mean, I think it depends what scale, right? So like, you know, material is enormous and is driving the work of, I don't know how many thousands of designers across the company. So you need a team there, no question. I came from LearnVest, which was a fintech startup that was bought by Northwestern Mutual. And initially, we didn't maybe need a team. When we were like 25, it was easy to communicate. When we got to be 70, it was, oh gosh, no, we really do need it. And you know, especially with complexity comes the need to dedicate resources. The other thing that is in the matrix of how you make that decision, I think, is how fast you have to move, right? So if you have a team whose sole focus is to create and maintain and evolve a design system, then the rest of your product designers can be focusing on shipping products, right? So there's that kind of calculation as well. Obviously, that comes with a cost. I happen to think, obviously, it's a good investment, but not required at all scale.
It's interesting because, like, I've worked at a small startup and then went back to Google, and it was like, whoa. But like, there is a parallel where when I was at Kickstarter and Etsy, there's always this evolution of like, oh, we need a way to standardize this. And I think like the interesting thing was at Kickstarter, which was tiny, but very like engineers, like designers wrote code, right? And engineers sat with designers. So there was this very interesting evolution of how do we organize our SaaS? How do we do these things so that effectively they were generating a design system? And I think like if you're at a small startup or if you're at a place, right, there's pull off your shelf design systems like Bootstrap, Material, whatever you might. But core, if you're a PM, right, are these two disciplines actually working with each other and thinking about, you know, scalability, of course, while they're, you know, just trying to, you know, effectively like find product market fit. You obviously want to prioritize finding product market fit, but like it's still having that eye. There's just that little like 3% of effort that can make you just think a little bit more of like working together. And I think this is important because it's easy to say we need a design system and then that becomes a power play, when actually it should be the reverse. The whole idea of the design system is so that people can focus on the core product, right? And so you really don't want to have that bad dynamic to happen.
Right. So Laura, we were talking a little bit earlier about your structure, which I think is a little bit different. Can you talk about how your designers have been working with the design system?
Yeah, so we're a pretty small design team. There are, I think, around 12 of us. So no one really has the bandwidth to be dedicated full time to the design system. So it's really a labor of love. I think what we're hoping to do is kind of expand out, like, who are the people that are really owning this thing, evangelizing this thing. But yeah, it's, you know, you're doing your normal day-to-day product-oriented work, but then how do you, have that mindset of how can this scale to other use cases? Or for this particular use case, how can I think about other ways that we've maybe solved something similar in the past? So you're thinking a little bit more holistically.
Yeah, that's great. And so if any of you have tried to institute a design system from scratch, you know it's a lot of effort. You have to compile all of your different assets, figure out what works well, what's consistent, what's not consistent. And it's a lot of upfront time needed to get to the place where you have a design system. So could you speak a little bit more about what you've seen in terms of ultimate benefits? You talked a bit about communication and culture and collaboration, that sort of thing. But do you have any specific examples of where you've really seen it win in terms of how the impact has had on your organizations?
So I was going to say, I think obviously the consistency that we've seen is great, especially at Amex. You know, they've rolled out a new global brand, so it's a global design language system, and it's driving that global consistency that complements our brand. Efficiency, that's obviously another big one. I think for me though, like more of a softer benefit is that it's taken a lot of opinion out of the discussions, right? So at Amex, you've got a lot of different ways that you can interpret our brand, and there's a lot of different ways you can interpret a color palette. And the design system language has really helped drive, I think Leland covered on this, the intent behind the narrative of how you use this system. And it really just cuts off out a lot of that discussion so that we can be quicker about making some decisions about how we pursue a product strategy, or for the designers to just kind of move forward. And you can just see when we bring new people on, like the design is consistent, and they're not sitting there just debating for days with different teams on how to, whether it should be like a blue button or a gray button. So that's been refreshing to see for me as a benefit, just cutting out some of that debate.
I had a nice sort of success story, anecdotal, I guess, but a product manager had some new concept that she wanted to pilot, and she worked with her designer, and she was so impressed by how quickly he turned around designs for this thing so we could get it into production and get it tested. And I talked to her a little bit about the fact that, yeah, we're designing for manufacturability. Like, kind of, I likened it to, you come home and you've got certain things in your cupboard, and like, how do you throw together a dinner? And like, that's kind of what the design system does for us, where it's like, okay, I'm going to take this and this and this, and then I'm going to mash it up, and now I've got this thing that's ready to test in the market.
So I think, so I'm new to Google, but at my last role, when we rolled out our design system, it took an enormous amount of coordination to actually get all the different parts of the consumer experience launching within 5 days of each other. And what I was most proud of was actually we saw a 15-point increase in the number of clients for our big NPS, Net Promoter Score study, who said they found there was a 15-point increase in customer satisfaction with the experience, I think because all the patterns actually looked the same, and there weren't different colors when you went to different sections that were slightly off, and that felt good to people. And we saw a 40% increase in people saying we're making continuous improvements for the better. So I was actually yes to all of the things, seeing similar things. But I think we underestimate how much our users actually appreciate a language where they no longer have the cognitive load of thinking about how to interact with us, and they can just concentrate on what they want to do with our products.
I mean, we had a new product launch while we were rolling out the new material system, like the themability we had and the new brand's application to that themability, which is what you're seeing, this building from white on the Google brand. And so News was basically rethinking how Google News was working. And you can see their usage of our componentry, their usage of our design. They were an early user of one of the first teams to use it, but allow them to focus on the really difficult problems of solving how do you serve up news instead of those things. All these core things went away. You weren't stuck in VP reviews around the color of the button or anything like that. Or even this waistline navigation, right? Navigation is so great to have palettes of navigation to choose from and a narrative behind those navigation methods so that you can focus on one, and if one works or one doesn't work, you have the backing narrative and backing research to talk about why that doesn't work. And that is compartmentalized in your discussions. You can focus on the really difficult problems, like how do I show this news story versus this news story? How do I show balance? All these things are much more higher order product problems and design problems than navigation, for example.
Yeah, that's great. So we talked a lot about consistency and efficiencies and all those great benefits that you get once you have a design system in place. One thing I've heard from people who are a little bit more hesitant to put in the effort to get this going within their own companies is the worry that this means we can't be creative anymore. Or maybe we don't need designers anymore because now we have a design system to do it all for us. Have you ever faced that kind of concern, and how have you addressed that on your teams?
Yeah. I heard that. Even some very design-friendly engineering counterparts were like, great, so now that we have the design system, we don't have to have this stuff designed. No. Just no. It's I don't know. I'll come up with a metaphor, but just because there's a bunch of makeup in your palette, if you have your 4-year-old put it on, it's gonna look really bad. You still need somebody to put. She's tried. Thankfully, not this morning. I hope. You guys can tell me. So it's like you still need somebody to actually think about how all those things go together. What it does, though, is it makes the whole process like a lot easier, more pleasant, and lets you concentrate on the hard stuff.
I think that perception might come from a very limited view of what design is, where I think a lot of companies still equate design with producing mocks and pushing pixels. So with that narrow description, yeah, a certain part of that should kind of over time go away, but you're then focusing on those more complex design problems, which I think is a far more valuable use of designers' time.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I mean, and I'll tell us a little bit of a story, and for those of my team who are in the audience, they'll know this story well. We've recently created something that we call FrankenHub, because we basically wanted to prove the point that if you just took all of these components that we've created that follow the design system language and you just throw them on a page without any thought process going into it or any user testing or experience design principles or thinking through the information architecture or the narrative of that hub, it completely falls apart. And so the result is this thing that we call FrankenHub, which is basically a hot mess of components on a page, but it looks beautiful. It's gorgeous. Like all the colors look the same. And we were actually nervous that some of the marketing team was going to be like, you've solved for everything. But if we were to put it in front of a user and we said, okay, in 5 seconds, find your card member agreement, it would completely fail. So I think we proved our point. Everyone understands that the design thinkers, the UX thinkers that we have on our team are still critical. We're still hiring more. It's scaling up. It's not going away. So as much as everyone thought that was going to solve all of our design problems, it's just one piece and one ingredient to the broader design process.
So to be fair, I don't think either one of us are saying that like our product and engineering friends are like a real Frankenstein or my 4-year-old, but just like it kind of, sometimes you need to go hyperbolic to prove a point. Yeah. It's just anything that makes the user go, is detracting from their product experience.
And my thing on the less designers, my kind of rebuke to, especially like engineering or PMs is it's like engineering has been doing this all along, right? They have been creating test harnesses, automated testing, libraries they pull in, right? Automated deployments, all these things. And there's not less engineers in the world. There's more engineers in the world because we get to solve more difficult problems. And I think design has just been a bit behind in that. And we are building things that are now, it just has to happen. So you're actually just seeing that evolution. Like we're all doing product development. This is an angle of product development. And it's going to happen, right? So there's not going to be less designers. There's going to be more designers because it is showing that it is such an intrinsic part of product development.
Yeah, that's great. So let's talk a bit more about like the operational impact that design systems have once they're in place for companies. I think this is where a lot of companies start off and they get this design system in place, they get the sticker sheets on the design side figured out, and they got the components all coded up on the engineering side. And then they figure out, okay, now what? And how do we actually make this work? So what kind of operational changes have you seen, especially for the product people in the room, on what processes need to change or anything else that has to change now that you've got your design system?
I think Priceline is a very A/B testing oriented culture. With the design system, I think one of the fears from product specifically was that, okay, well, what sort of lean experiments can we still run? Is this going to limit what we can do? And I think that what the design system is starting to shift is we're no longer thinking about those lean experiments that are button-colored tests, and now we're thinking more about, okay, well, what's the content inside of this component? Is it contextually relevant? Is that something it's exposing the different testable layers, I think, a little bit more, where there's this presentational layer, yes, but we kind of got stuck on that. What's happening in this static content layer, what language are you using, and then what's the dynamic content that's feeding into that, and then what's the placement of this component. So I think it's really revealing that these features and these tests aren't rasterized. You can expose all those different layers.
Yeah, I just want to that. And I think for PMs, it really has to up the PM sense of what are you going to test? Because the days of testing the button size were they're over. And it was a really easy thing to do. I'm just going to do this. I used to call we had a product page once at a different company, and I was this is the map reduced product page where it's just AI is determining it, and it actually ends up locally maximizing everything, and then it actually, if you look macro, it sucks. And I think it's the big things now you get to test.
Yeah.
One of our early, I'd say, learnings was version control. So I think that's something everyone needs to be aware of going into it, especially the product managers. I think they underestimated, because it is living, breathing code, when there is a design system language update, the ripple effect that has on the components that they're maintaining, the components that they're pushing live in the moment of that upgrade going live for the design language system. So I think we went through some pretty hardcore pain points early on around version control that then just informed our process for the better. We do tech releases now that are centered around the next version of DLS, and all of our engineers are trained and equipped to handle that, and they know how to do testing, and it's automated now. I don't think it's definitely not perfect yet, but I think that's just something to go in with wide eyes is version control and really partnering early on with product engineering, ops, and design to make sure that you know sort of how you're going to handle that version control, especially if you're working at a company with scale.
So I would say the unknown, right? So I think one of the things that I didn't at least nail early on was how does something get into the design system? Okay, we didn't know we needed, maybe like a new icon is easy, but a new kind of component for some reason we hadn't thought of. How do you get that through all the testing for its different use cases into the design system and operationalizing that so that all the right parties are looking at it? I think that's been maybe one of our biggest challenges is figuring out how to go from identifying something, getting it into a sandbox, testing it, and then getting it into the system.
Yeah, like what's that contribution process look like? How does everyone contribute, but how is their sort of order centered around that?
Yeah, maintenance as well. I think there's always confusion about, okay, this thing's broken or it doesn't work for this use case. Like who's responsible to update this thing?
Right.
And I think, again, trying to create that culture of ongoing contribution where you're reinvesting in this system to help your counterparts elsewhere in the company. So that's definitely a culture shift.
Yeah, and what other kind of factors influence how you evolve the system over time? Is it something that's kind of small changes here and there, or do you ever go through and revamp everything, and what are the impacts of that?
I mean, I think obviously there are lots of small changes all the time. And I think too, one of the big selling points for a design system is if you've got a rebrand on the horizon or some sort of redesign, that you're set up well to do that sort of, your audit is simpler, I think. And then you can kind of figure out which points are kind of controlling that brand. Like what are the aspects of this that do need to be updated? You don't have to touch everything. You might be able to make more surgical changes. I think that's really nice. And also you can kind of expose where you might need to inject a little bit more personality. So like, is there a need to layer on more motion or more animation in certain spaces or something like that? So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would just double that in that we found that we waited 4 years, so material design launched in 2014, and then effectively had this we were doing a lot of stuff, and then in 2018 we're at I/O, and we actually had to really pull back. This is a big PM effort, to say we are not waiting another 4 years to launch the next design system, and it is easy to fall into that realm of it's too big, but really going down towards we actually said we are now going to effectively do releases monthly. Right, and that was a big shift for the team to think about that this design system will now evolve. And also, it's what the structures do you have in place to allow for evolution. Going back to the version control, that becomes way more important, right?
Yeah, I feel like we're sort of in the middle of revamping right now, so we haven't come across this problem. DLS is almost driving the cart a little bit in terms of how we are approaching our revamp, so it's a hard question for me to answer. I think it's more about the contribution process and the iteration and how we think about that version control and when can we iterate. And I don't think we've nailed that yet. It's still a little bit of we don't know. And we have a new DLS leader who's coming in to sort of figure this out in partnership with us as a product and design team. So I think I don't know the answer to that question yet. We're sort of in the middle of our revamp, and I think we've definitely come across moments where we're we designed this login component like this, but it doesn't work for this, and so how do we handle that, and when do we change something, and then how do you then implement that across everything else where it's already been implemented? I think we've come across those scenarios, but we don't have that operational pain point nailed quite yet. It's something we need to figure out still.
Makes sense. So I think we've touched a little bit on the fact that you don't just have the design components there. It's also about their usage and the guidelines and what it means in terms of how designers use them in their designs and their experiences, maybe even how they're coded and guidelines around how that works for the engineering side of the house as well. So can you give some examples of how you've managed that documentation process and the impact that's had on the overall product development process?
I mean, it's a little bit disorganized for us right now, but we essentially have a living roadmap from a design perspective, like what sorts of things are causing a lot of confusion. We're doing, like, I would like to be doing more, like treating this more like a proper product and doing more proactive customer engagement and customer research, but we're gathering a lot of anecdotal stuff, like this particular component has a lot of confusion around it. So we're sort of prioritizing what we need to create documentation around that way. Where are we getting the most questions? Like, what are we getting Slack messages about all the time? So we should probably encode whatever those answers are in some place that's like more accessible. So.
Yeah, so we were actually at LearnVest, we were early users when it was called Brand AI before the product was bought by InVision and then turned into Design System Manager. So we just kind of like rolled with that train. But what worked really nicely is that there was the single source both for the designers, for the maintenance, and our whole tech team was in there to help with that sort of going from design component to sandbox to graduating to being part of the actual system through there. And then, it like exports directly in all the designers' sketch files. And then we would do sort of like monthly updates and, what's changed in your design system this month. And some people found that really helpful, designers. Some product people were curious and we love them for it. And then we're doing the auto sync into, but you were asking about tooling, right?
Tooling's kind of the output of it maybe, but it's more like how do you manage the documentation aspect, which could be via a tool.
So we wanted it all online, all open to everybody, and nobody having to think. So that's why we were relying on our tools a lot. And then like InVision for sharing the actual designs and in spec mode for the engineering.
So we have, similar to what we were saying before, we have I would say a product manager, hybrid design ops manager role that runs point on our design system language. So if you think of the design system language is in itself a product, she's basically managing the backlog. She's helping with the prioritization. She's organizing all the ceremonies. She's sort of the evangelist, if you will, of her product, which is the design system language. And so she's actually out on maternity leave right now. We miss her very much because I feel like we need her. She's the heartbeat of it. But she very much is, Duck. She does release notes. She's using Jira. She's using Confluence. She's using all the same tools that product and engineer are using, and really managing her backlog and making sure that there's as much transparency as possible, so that people know sort of what's coming around the corner, what's launched. What does that V6 release look like? She is the heartbeat of the tool and really treats it like a product, and I think manages it well like a product owner. So she uses similar tools to what we use in just our day-to-day product.
I think that's awesome because we did it both ways at LearnVest, where we had a product manager and we're managing everything through Jira, and then needs shifted and she got reallocated, and it was much harder without it. So I'd say if you can affect it, have a product manager. We need your brains, and it helps. I much prefer that way.
Great. So as always, hindsight's 20/20. And if you could go back in time and change something about how you've approached building out your design system over time, what would you do differently?
I think I would have taken more time, and I don't think that this is unrecoverable, but I would have taken more time to establish a better cross-functional team that had shared ownership of this thing. I think we have not done a very good job of including brand marketing in this. That's a big oversight. We haven't done a great job including folks from the sales side. There is an extension that goes out to our suppliers as well. So I think that's something that I would have done differently, is who's that core team where you can have evangelists built into different parts of the organization, talking about it and nothing else. But
so I think I would do two things. So one, I don't feel like we have yet nailed how to integrate copy into it, where it's been really, really easy for everybody to follow. So I'd want to, I'm not sure what the answer is, but get that in sooner. And then the other thing, I've now been in 2 organizations where we did the consumer design system and then cascaded the enterprise design system off of that. I'm going to ask Leland. Leland, would we want to experiment someday and do it all together? Where
we are, actually.
Well, yes. Okay, yeah, okay, cool.
Well, no, and I think that's the reverse. I think we made this cardinal mistake of not thinking of enterprise enough in one of the audiences. What I would say is actually we didn't do audience segmentation, right? That, and that's bringing PM involved is effectively looking at what are our actual audiences and how does the design system affect those audiences. You have enterprise, you have consumer, awesome. And then really thinking that way. And that was if I was going to go back in time, that's one of the things. Yeah, so that I'm very excited. I'm only 4 weeks into Google. I'm super excited about that because I feel like I've done the cascading twice, and you're always kind of oh, if only I'd known.
Yeah, I guess to build off of I wasn't part of the original team that lifted it off the ground. I was an early adopter, but I think one of the things that I observed, similar theme, is that and I mentioned this, when we got it off the ground, it was centered around one aspect of a much broader product ecosystem. And so we probably took too much of a lens on that specific set of applications. But it's a little bit chicken and egg, because at the same time, I think you need to start sort of small in a company like Amex. You're not going to be able to boil the ocean in one go. So to build off that, I think in the early days, we were probably a little bit too much of a police force a bit with the DLS. It was it's this way or the highway, we're not adjusting anything. And I think you need to know that it's going to be iterative, and as you scale, you have to be so it's more of a behavioral change more than anything else. I think just being a bit more open-minded in the early days instead of being as rigid. But I think, again, it's a little chicken and egg, because you also need that to be that rigid up front to get the vision across and get the point across about what we're trying to do here. So
yeah, I think that a lot of design systems do start out as enforcement policies rather than enablement platforms, and that is something that you don't win any friends that way.
You end up alienating everyone that you're trying to get to adopt it.
Absolutely.
So I think you just have to sort of make sure you strike that balance.
Yeah, we've been thinking about that the design system has a product loop, effectively, and the enforcement, same thing, happened the same thing. And we're thinking about you need to think about it as a full product loop, where you have awareness, you have adoption, then you have the implementation, right? And then you have adaptation, right? Enterprise comes along, right? And then even better, you have appropriation, where people are I'm taking your design system and I'm gonna go do it somewhere else. And that might work, right? If someone takes Priceline's design system and goes build something else, maybe that's okay, right? And just thinking about that full product loop.
Or is it?
Yeah, I think that's something too that we probably should have established earlier on, is we've got this open source system. It's largely the most elemental components, but then we have a lot of stuff they're almost proprietary components. And how do we segment that out so that we're not exposing our special sauce or whatever, if that's a thing that exists. But yeah, I think that delineation is something that we probably could have spent more time thinking about.
Yeah, that's great. So one last question for me, and then we might be able to have a couple minutes for audience questions. But where do you see design systems headed in the future?
Well, back to my view that it should be a language. I think it should eventually, design systems should extend beyond visual language. It should be something that we're thinking about, okay, what is the design system for voice like? What is the design system for gesture like? How can it kind of expand beyond what we're currently thinking of it as?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Just bringing in more channels and maybe even more physical stuff, and making it really be the heartbeat of the language and the narrative that you're trying to share with your audience. And then I think this probably is not so future-facing because everyone's trying to do it right now, but just more integration with tools just to build off the efficiency that the DLS already contributes to the product development process. Is how do we just automate more? How do we get everything working together more seamlessly? I think is going to be a big theme. And those would be the, without going like super crazy and being like robots are going to control it all, but maybe Leland thinks that, I don't know.
No, actually, no. I think maybe AI can help with some of the design decisions effectively, like, and you're starting to see this in some tools, right? But that's definitely helpful. But I think it's as design pushes further into the background, right? Are we looking at experience systems, and what does that mean, right? So if you think about voice and language and all these things, again, they're not pixels. We've all been saying it's more than just the pixels. How do we start componentizing all of that stuff? And I think that's a big challenge.
Yeah, but I think that the upside there is, again, that narrow definition of what design is expands as your design system expands. So that's really exciting to me, at least.
Great. We have just a couple minutes. Does anyone have any questions? I'll go back here first.
I have a question about when you have systems in place that when you have existing products in place that haven't adopted the design thinking process and you're trying to implement them. What's some good advice you can recommend? You mentioned culture is a cultural thing. What's what part of organization can you provide some of the first steps to help really help people?
Sure, let me just repeat that question. So the question was, if you have existing products in place that don't yet use the design system, how do you get them to adopt it?
Yeah. We did design sprints.
I was literally just going to say, do a design sprint.
Yeah, that was a big way, just bring people into the house.
Yeah. I would do that, but I would do a before and after testing of it. So I think you want to show what the value of the design system is. So you want to baseline with what you have now, even though it might seem why do we want to test? We know there's something wrong. Test it. Figure out what matters there and what you want to push, and then test for that again with whatever the product of your design sprints are, and bring as many people in as you can so that they feel like they're part owners of it, and show value.
So that's really interesting that I now want to incorporate is, so in the beginning of design sprints, we do share outs. Mm-hmm. And I think thinking about data, I don't think data enough is in the beginning of a design sprint, right? So what's some data we know? What's even an experiment we've just run?
Yeah.
Bringing that in, I think would be really interesting.
Yeah, show your dirty underwear there at the beginning and be here's our thing, here's what's wrong with it, here's what people tell us about it. And, respectfully throw things at it. And then at the end of it, show, and this is how much X, Y, or Z improved, right? And that sets you up to actually go and do the thing because you know sort of what direction is going to move whatever your KPIs are. So as product people, help us come up with good KPIs because your designers can design towards that. So figure out what the proxy for, better product, yay! Okay, well, what does that mean in terms of what you can actually measure? Play Moneyball with design.
Great, I want to go in the back here, far back.
Yeah, thanks so much. This has been an amazing talk. It's clear that design system has huge benefits, and I think the number one thing you guys have outlined is it lets you focus on the most important questions. How do you really move the needle for your users? So I work on a small startup. I'm PM. We have one designer and 3 engineers. What benefits can startups gain from building a design system, and how much should we choose to invest when we're so small?
Sure, let me just repeat that again. So the question is, if you're in a startup world, what are the benefits for startups in particular, and how do you get going in that kind of environment?
I would say use material design or Bootstrap or one of the design systems that are out there to start, but don't be afraid to adapt it, right? Don't just be oh, I'm just going to color in the boxes of material design. That would be very bad, right? Really think about what does the design system mean for my product, right? How can I just use it as a way to lift me up so I can then focus on the deeper issues?
Yeah, I think like one of the points of a design system is never doing file new again. Like you're never starting from scratch. And so I totally agree. Like you shouldn't feel like you have to start from scratch with your own design system. Adapt something that's already out there. Like that's kind of the ethos or whatever.
And like when you're doing that, sorry, just to pile on, like think about what your brand promise is, right? If you're at a startup, you have some big idea of what you're trying to achieve. Think about the changes that you make to the design system in that context of what's different about my brand and how do I push that.
That's great. I think we have time for one more question. So I'll go in the front here.
My question is more about evangelism, right? So as people are adopting the design link system, like can you give some tips of like how do we have these conversations with other leadership or groups in the organization and the awareness of these things to bring value to your team or to it?
Yeah, so the question was, how do you evangelize design systems across the organization?
My favorite way is data. So I'll say that my last company, pre-design system, we had a customer satisfaction with our digital experiences that was 1/2 of what it was once we launched the design system. I think it sucked when we did the first measurement, but then it was like really happy when we did the next one. So I'd say when you're going to your partners outside of design, especially when you're managing up, data. Like, how does it help the business? Oh, okay, it gets people through our conversion funnel, 9 seconds faster. Awesome. That kind of stuff.
Yeah, and so data from the bottom and value prop from the top of the chain.
More succinct, totally.
It's like, because you kind of have to really show also the projected value proposition of a design system, right? And the big mistake is to say, oh, we're just going to get efficiencies. It's more about the unquantifiable thing isn't just we're going to save X engineers or X designers. It's more about, no, these engineers and designers can now do this many more valuable things, which is way more high value than just saving time.
So we are out of time. So thank you all very much.